You know, from time to time, even this week, before the election, I just feel it's necessary to get history straight because people are on TV and radio who are rewriting it and should know better. But they're very flip. They put out these comments in the middle of an election and they get all worked up. First of all, a president is not a dictator as much as Obama would like to be one. But Reagan respected the separation of powers. Reagan understood what executive orders were for, not in lieu of legislation, but administrative steps for the most part, for the executive branch. When Reagan was elected president, he had a very long coattail. He won the Senate. And that was unexpected, the Republicans to take the Senate. They didn't have a huge majority, but they had a majority. And Tip O'Neill ran the House. Tip O'Neill was 100 times smarter than Nancy Pelosi and 100 times tougher. I'm just telling you. It's true. It's not hard to be either of those, is it? But anyway, I want to go through this. I won't spend all program on it, or this whole hour for that matter. But I want you to know it, and we will link to these items after the program. Veronique Derugi did a great piece a few years back at AEI. And she pointed out, and why am I doing this now? Not only to correct the record, because going forward, should Romney win, there are things that Reagan did that we want him to do, and more. Given we're much further down the road to destruction than we were before, 30 years ago. So this is a good starting point. She writes, Reagan sought and won more spending cuts than any other modern president. He's the only president in the last 40 years to cut inflation-adjusted non-defense outlays, which fell by 9.7% during his first term. She says, sadly, during his second term, Reagan did not manage to cut non-defense discretionary spending, as it grew by 0.2%. There's two reasons for this. We lost the Senate in 1986, so the Democrats controlled the House and the Senate, and Iran-Contra had a devastating impact on the administration. Just so you know. But even in that second term, she said his record is still quite remarkable if compared to other administrations. Every other president since Lyndon Johnson serving a full 4-year term did not even do as well as Reagan in his less impressive second term. So his second term when non-defense discretionary spending, domestic spending that means, grew at 0.2%, was the smallest growth in modern presidential history. She writes, Reagan understood economics, and he knew an unjustified economic subsidy when he saw one. He believed the federal government had usurped private, state, and local responsibilities, and so he thought that most departments' budgets should be cut. Reagan cut the budget of 8 agencies out of 15 during his first term and 10 out of 15 during his second term. And remember, Congress passes these bills, the president signs them or vetoes them. So he had to fight endlessly. And the government was shut down, as I recall, 3 different times because Reagan said, no, I'm not signing these massive omnibus bills. Now, Bill Clinton cut the budget of 9 out of 15 agencies during his first term, but cut none during his second term. President George W. Bush cut none of the agency's budgets, period. See, we can't afford another Republican spending administration like that, with all due respect, because I have high regard for George W. Bush, an incredibly decent human being. But his spending was completely out of control. He didn't veto anything, or he vetoed very little, as I recall. She goes on, Reagan is the only president to have cut the budget of the Department of Housing and Urban Development, HUD, in one of his terms, a total of 40%. Total of 40%. Reagan's the only president to have cut the budget of the Department of Transportation. He cut it by 10.5% during his first term and 7.5% during his second term. These are real cuts. She said inflation related. During his first term in office, Reagan cut the real budget of the Department of Education by 18.6%, while Nixon increased its equivalent, which was part of the Health and Education and Welfare Department at the time, by 19%. The Education Department increased by 22% under Bush, 41, and 38.5% under Carter. It increased by a whopping 67.6% under George W. Bush. Reagan cut it by over 18%. Well, Mark, he was supposed to get rid of it. Reagan sought to get rid of the Department of Education, and he was told in no uncertain terms by the new Senate Majority Leader, the first Senate Majority Leader since the 1950s. He was told no by Howard Baker. Howard Baker told him they had 19 votes to kill the Department of Education. Even though Reagan swept in all these Republicans into the Senate, only 19 of them supported eliminating the Department of Education. So the proposal was killed in the Republican Senate. But he tried. So then he slashed its budget, something no other president has done, whether as standalone as Department of Education or part of, at the time, HEW. Reagan cut the budget of the Department of Commerce by 29% in constant dollars during his first term and another 3% during his second term. Clinton, by contrast, increased that department's budget by 24% in his first term and then 96.7% in his second term. Reagan cut the real budget of the Department of Agriculture by 24% during his second term in office. Reagan never cut the budgets of Defense, Health and Human Services, Justice, or State. Reagan cut or didn't cut. He had to fight for every cut he wanted because it had to come from the House, had to get through the Senate. Then a liberal think tank piece also commented on what Reagan was proposing at the time. I want you to hear this because I lived through this, as many people did, but I was in the administration and I remember this. Reagan was proposing cuts all the time, folks, in virtually every department, in virtually every program, bar some that we just talked about. But here's what these liberals write from this liberal think tank back in the time. The decision on the part of the Department of Health and Human Services, HHS, not to fund a Center for Poverty Research is a small indication of an enormous change in the making. The Reagan administration's shift in national priorities. Indeed, these two wrote, the President's 1982 and 83 budget reform plans and the allocation of funds among programs have represented a sharp break with recent past. It's evident the administration is attempting to reverse the trend of the 60s and 70s, which have been to move away from military expenditures and toward outlays for social programs. They're right. The proposals already implemented as well as those announced as part of the fiscal 83 budget are designed to reduce government spending as a percentage of the gross national product and to increase the proportion of the budget spent on national defense. These liberals at this liberal think tank were exactly right. They also wrote in part, many of the programs which grew most rapidly from 1965 to 1981, food stamps, Comprehensive Employment and Training Act, that's the old CETA law, federal guaranteed loan programs for higher legal assistance, for example, have sustained the largest cuts under Reagan. Compared to Carter's proposed 82 budget, the fiscal 82 budget that was proposed by Reagan represented a reduction of $44 billion or 5.7%, and all categories except national defense were reduced. Keep in mind, when we talk about what Reagan cut, he sought bigger, broader, across-the-board cuts in the budgets that he proposed to Congress, but they never passed a single one of his budgets. The full extent of the shift in priorities being carried out by Reagan, these liberals write, can be seen in the estimates for the 86 budget in which 19.9% of gross domestic product, rather than the current 23%, is scheduled to be spent. He was trying, in the first years of his term, to slash the percentage of the federal government that was taking money out of the private sector from 23% to 20%. A massive cut at the time. But he couldn't get it done because Tip O'Neill said no and the Republicans in the Senate fought him. They went on. The budgetary retrenchment and reallocations are likely to affect income distribution to alter economic behavior. The 1982 budget cuts, Reagan cuts, exceeded 20%, and many of the programs introduced or expanded since the 1960s, blah, blah, blah. I'm telling you all this because the man had guts and he made a run at this over and over and over again. Can you imagine what he would have done if he had a Republican House and a Republican Senate with conservatives, which is why I am so focused on this Senate race, on these Senate races, to get more and more conservatives in there. Should Romney win to help Romney? Should Obama win to stop Obama? And when Reagan left office after 8 years, the size of the federal workforce was cut by about 5%. Man made a great run at it. Did a lot of great things, including on the spending side and the government side. He was often blocked by his own party, often blocked by the Democrats. So no, my dear friend Ann, Reagan was not a big spender. First of all, he wasn't a dictator. So those decisions weren't made on his own. He shut down the government several times. He fought and fought and fought with Congress over spending. He fought with Republicans over spending. And he never had both houses of Congress. And in his last 2 years, the Democrats controlled Congress altogether. And then George H.W. Bush was elected president, often called the third Reagan term. He was elected president, and he lurched back toward the Rockefeller, Scranton, Ford, Nixon Republicanism. Reagan set the foundation, and it was rejected by Bush 41, rejected by Bush 43, as it's rejected by Jeb Bush.